Trinity Talks. Today's news, tomorrow's leaders. Today, Trinity Talks COP29. Today we're here with Samuel,
Matthew,
and Kalel.
So Matthew, do you want to give us an explanation of what COP actually is?
Yeah, so sure. A COP, or also known as a Conference of the Parties, is a committee created after an international treaty is signed, which is tasked with making decisions about how that treaty is implemented. COP29 is the latest annual meeting of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is currently undergoing in Baku, Azerbaijan. The primary goal of this COP is to scale up climate finance to help developing nations tackle the adverse effects of climate change, and a heavy focus on adaptation for developing nations is currently going on because they're the ones who suffer the most from the effects of climate change.
Yeah, I think personally COP29 marked an important gathering of global leaders and stakeholders to discuss climate action. There was quite significant attention on Amazon's role in environmental sustainability. While progress was made on initiatives like green technology investment and biodiversity protection challenges such as bridging the climate finance gap and ensuring stronger global commitments remain. I feel like the summit reflected a mix of optimism and urgency, emphasizing the need for continued collaboration to address climate goals effectively. What about you guys?
Yeah, I just want to say before we even get into the podcast, I'm sorry to my geography teacher for what I'm about to say, but honestly, like my view on climate change and my view on COP is really quite pessimistic and negative. I think the COP has been like a repeated failure. It's been boycotted by lots of different environmental organisations. I think it's repeatedly had a lack of success and lack of cooperation. I think that the Paris Agreement and like COP, the last COP, was actually quite useful and like actually quite good at getting different agreements and different things signed. But I think ultimately like COP is fundamentally weakened by different things. I know that something that's hanging over this COP is obviously the election of Donald Trump as a new US president. So just to get that out of the way right at the beginning of this podcast, my views on like COP are negative. So take that in mind what I say going forward.
Yeah, I guess mine are quite neutral. And you, Ma?
I'll be honest, I don't really have like a strong opinion like it sounds like Kalel does, but
It's quite neutral as well then.
I wouldn't say neutral. I think the idea of having a conference with so many like leaders is a good thing, but I think the execution of it has just been awful, as we're going to talk about today in COP29. So yeah, I think that's my view.
Right, so as we know, COP29 was in Azerbaijan, and obviously this brings around a lot of controversy. Loads of critics questioned like the suitability of Azerbaijan as a host due to its heavy dependence on fossil fuel exports and its plans to increase natural gas production, contradicting the climate goals typically associated with COP events. I have a statistic here where approximately 90% of the country's exports are fossil fuels, which, as we could agree, is quite anti-climate change.
Yeah.
But what do you guys think about that?
Let's be straight up honest about this. It's shocking, like it's a shambles. Other than that, to like get onto what like the analysis I have on this, and like the reason why I think it's bad is I understand the fear around it, and like I do understand part of the reason why they host it in countries where like these issues are actually important. The main theory is, or at least the theory as I understand it, I know there are also other reasons, by hosting COP in countries that do have particularly bad emissions. So for example, next year COP's going to be in Brazil, this year's Azerbaijan. It's hoping that you get them engaged in it and like engaged in COP and hoping that they, you know, as a result of COP, like move on and are able to be more green. And that's a kind of encouraging thing. But like in practice, I just think this doesn't happen, right? Like I just say that I think that if you're like the government of Azerbaijan and you're looking at like COP, you don't following COP suddenly like change your economy and like suddenly become a green country. You sit there, you think, oh, 90% of our economy is like oil, and then what ends up happening, like we see, I know Matthew definitely has some things about this, is you see like the Azerbaijani president, for example, trying to like push oil at the climate conference. Like I think it's very, very shocking. And the second thing I think as well, kind of to add on to that, is I think another negative of having COP in these countries which like have a hugely negative stance on climate change, like countries like Azerbaijan, it just undermines the whole ceremony as far, or like not even ceremony, but the whole conference as far as like seeming very not being able to get change, right? Just note COP, a lot of it is symbolic. It's kind of like Matthew says, this kind of meeting of all the countries. They all sit down, they all work together for the future of our planet. And it's very like idealistic in similar ways to like the UN might be for some like outside viewers. But it undermines a lot of that when, you know, you have this kind of idealistic, let's save the world together, guys. And at the same time, you're hosting a country that like has huge gas emissions, huge like greenhouse gas emissions, and like huge amounts of oil in its economy.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a quick question. So it sounds like you're like quite like you're talking about how that these countries that emit the most or import or export a lot of the fossil fuels don't really take or like pay attention to exactly what's going on in these events. So then, what's the point of hosting them?
I kind of wanted to save it for something later on, but definitely like it's greenwashing, right? And I for people who don't know and listeners don't know what we mean by this, greenwashing is essentially when a country, like, will, for example, host COP or like host green events to kind of cover up and look like they're making green action, even though in fact they're like are producing more greenhouse emissions, things like this. I think this is definitely a huge example of greenwashing, like the Azerbaijani president wanting to seem like he's forthcoming on climate when in reality Azerbaijan really hasn't made that many steps towards, decreasing its carbon emissions, hasn't made that many steps towards net zero. Azerbaijan is, like, as we know, SOCAR, the like largest oil company in Azerbaijan, and like I think it actually is the largest company in Azerbaijan, full stop. Like, it makes up a huge part of Azerbaijan's economy. I just think that like this is another example again of greenwashing, where countries are able to use events like COP to try to promote a green image globally, when in reality I think it's far from this. I think it's much more negative, and I think in reality Azerbaijan like isn't really a forthcoming kind of climate supporter.
Yeah.
Is complete opposite, right? Like, Azerbaijan's very much on the side of wanting to keep fossil fuels and like keep production of things like oil, because fundamentally it benefits them and they benefit from like exports, things like this of oil.
Yeah, I kind of want to touch specifically on the president of Azerbaijan. I think his name is Ilham Aliyev, who described in the opening speech of this COP, which we kind of touched on. I think it's absolutely ridiculous
Me
as well.
too.
Describing fossil fuels as a quote gift from God, and he's literally signed even more oil and gas deals during the summit. So I think that in itself, for me, kind of really puts like rotten eggs on the table of COP29, just because how on earth can a president of the country that's hosting the thing about the climate that's killing the world go off and sign more deals which literally make the issue even worse?
Like, yeah, it's really shocking. It's literally like I was so shocked when I saw it, because like wrong crowd, right?
Yeah.
The whole week or like, not even a whole week, but from the beginning of the conference we've had speeches from different like representatives. I think Antonio Guterres of the UN was there as well, speaking about how countries should come together and like try to achieve climate objectives and
Exactly.
decrease their emissions, work together, cooperation, and also climate financing. To have someone else like after that then come up and like have a completely contradictory message, calling like gas and oil gifts from God.
Yeah.
I think it's just really goes against the message of the UN. I think an important thing to note is that for like listeners, that while we're being critical of this doesn't represent the like stance of all countries in the UN. No, like a lot of countries or not even UN, in the conference, like obviously don't have these views and they are pro climate change. Following this speech and the huge amount of criticism that came after it, like the organisers of COP, like UN, different countries did come out to very quickly try to separate themselves from this and say that actually this isn't what we represent, and we obviously want like climate change and reaffirm the objectives. But I think it's something like this is, even if it doesn't represent what actually the policy that comes out of COP looks like, and obviously I think there are other things going on behind the scenes at COP which are important, like we do get agreements. I think it just really undermines the like symbolic nature of COP, and also just like the ceremony as a whole to the outside viewer, because now rather than hearing about the climate deals that are going on, or rather than like for the regular person in the public to think, oh look, like our governments are working together, they instead see some guy on the media who's like the president of Azerbaijan who's hosting the COP saying that gas is a gift from God. I think it really just undermines like COP entirely, and it really is a bad way to start off kind of a climate conference.
Yeah, something else that I think that you kind of talked about is how countries are kind of trying to distance themselves from what he said. I think that undermines COP in itself, just because I think that they should be standing up and saying what he said is just completely wrong, and that, like you said, it's like it's the wrong crowd, like the completely wrong crowd. Like, could you imagine being the leader of like Barbados or Vanuatu, where your literal civilians are running out of land on their farms, or their island is being flooded every single day from sea level rise or increased rainfall? Like, could you imagine how much of a spit in the face that would feel for like the president of Barbados, for example?
Yeah, and I know the president of Barbados has played quite a key role in like as far as a speaker. The like president of Barbados has been speaking a lot. I think they did actually speak against this and kind of call it. It was very critical of saying that like it, undermines what they're trying to do basically at the climate conference. And I think a lot of the messaging from smaller countries who are affected by climate change is not only on that, but also on wanting larger countries kind of pay up and take responsibility for their like their part in, you know, the climate. So for example, US, China. This is where I think it's really important to state as well, and it's something that I really want to get out there in this podcast, is that what we're talking about, right, even with like countries working together and trying to take responsibility, many countries didn't even like, their presence is notably missing from COP for like a variety of different reasons. No, China hasn't attended. I think Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz wasn't there for, I don't remember the exact reason, but he had like a prior commitment engagement.
Yeah, and even the French top climate official cancelled her trip in response to his attacks on Western countries and what he said about oil and gas in the middle of the conference.
The perception of outside viewers as COP, and I think the perception that they try to push is, and like the narrative is one of COP being a huge coming together, being able to agree and like work together to the future of the climate, and then they use climate change as like a part of that to say that climate change is an issue that's coming very quickly, so as a result we need COPs like this to act very fast to try to get change, and they use that to try to spur countries to change. But I think what the actual narrative is and what COP actually looks like is, it looks like a whole lot of like disagreeing. I think it looks like a lot of uneasy alliances that do get made. So note, after like the Paris Agreement and things like this, you do get some compromise, but I think ultimately, like over time, these policies only really are effective on climate if they last, right? I think, I don't know if it's something that we're going to talk a lot about in this episode, but you know, Trump coming into power again, and obviously we know what happened in his last presidency. He withdrew from the Paris Agreement. I really think that even if there are agreements that are come to in this COP, and they do make agreements on climate finance, which was specifically a focus of this COP, I think it's really undermined by the fact that China isn't at the conference altogether, and they're one of the largest you know, emitters of greenhouse gases. But also, I don't think the US was present either. And if they were, like
A small group.
yeah, I think as well, like, my point is, even if they are, I think the climate policy really changes under Trump, and like, I don't really think it's going to be good going forward for the climate with Trump as president, and I don't think that COP is going to do much to change that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that ultimately climate change is an extremely complex topic with so many diverse views from different leaders and diverse opinions from different countries. That
There are lots of diverse countries at COP. I think that the presence of smaller countries really helps. One thing I'd really say about COP though is that I think it tends to, like, upon the, you know, at the start of COP, there's kind of this image presented as like, you know, we're all united for one objective. But then by the end of COP, what it looks more like, it looks like a coalition of smaller countries that are really affected by climate change. Not like a lot of African countries, countries like Barbados. They kind of group together on one end and say, okay, these bigger countries really need to pay. We like suffer a lot from climate change. Note like fishing, different things that like are hugely harmed, and billions of dollars are lost for these countries by climate change. They kind of are on one end, and on the other end you have huge like emitters that have benefited from greenhouse gases and using fossil fuels. So note here you have like the US, China, who like are on the outside open to kind of climate change, and they engage with it, or like open to working to help like deal with climate change. But I think that the thing that actually happens and the thing that actually changes is that like these two groups are really opposed to each other, right? We say that like there are some groups, so for example Russia, countries like that, where it is directly in their interest to like not cooperate with COP or to not really buy into climate change. Like, no, Azerbaijan is even an example of this, right? Like for Azerbaijan, like acting to climate change isn't for them like an abstract thing in the same way it might be for us, right? So for us in the UK, we've been maybe more successful than some other countries on climate change. A lot of this is because our economy isn't necessarily as dependent on fossil fuels, right? Like we say that what happens is that them changing and them being more cooperative with COP looks like them losing like jobs, their economy kind of failing and being worse. And that has like huge impacts for them in a different way than it would for us. So note like, even if they're like hosting the ceremony and they maybe have this like outside view of, you know, wanting to help facilitate action on climate, I think the reality is far different, where a lot of these countries that are huge emitters like China, like Russia, like Azerbaijan, they really don't want to help deal with climate change. And I think that's just because of how much it harms their economies and that kind of influence it has.
You know what I think is quite interesting about that as well? One country you didn't mention that didn't, the leader didn't go, Brazil, who, as we know, is going to host COP30. President Luiz didn't go, and many critics are arguing that the absences, they reflect a lack of urgency and commitment to trying to address climate change at the higher levels. It could also, as a result, undermine Europe's commitment to the global climate change. But if we slightly go back a bit, back to President Ilham Aliyev's gift from God speech, I feel like Kalel's got a little video, a little clip to play for us.
Yeah,
we can give our opinions.
very interesting clip, right? This is I think the news was actually broke I
few
want to
days
say
ago.
this morning or a few days ago. Actually, no,
Yeah.
sorry, from COP, there was a secret footage caught of COP29 chief Elnor Sultanov discussing oil and gas deals. I know, shocking, right? Have a listen to this.
As I said, we have a lot of pipeline infrastructure. We have a lot of gas fields that are to be developed. We have a lot of green projects that SOCAR is very interested in. There are a lot of joint ventures that could be established, potential joint ventures. Our SOCAR trading is trading oil and gas all over the world, including in Asia. So to me, these are the possibilities to explore. But in any case, this is something that you need to be talking to SOCAR. And I would be happy to create a contact between yourself and them, your team and their team, so that they can start discussion.
What do you guys have to think after hearing that?
I just think it's absolutely like ridiculous that he could say that in the middle of a climate conference that he is part of hosting. And I think the first thing I want to touch on that he says is that he's not just looking to sort of increase fossil fuels just in Azerbaijan. He's looking at actually diversifying, going across like the Pacific, I think he said, and going across the world and building new gas lines and oil lines across the world. So it's not like he's just trying to increase like fossil fuels the emission locally. He's trying to do it across the world now.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's undermining the efforts that COP is created in order to do, like help with climate change and everything. Like the rhetoric clashes with the commitments made at COP29 and as well as other international climate agreements. Whilst we know, like Azerbaijan really rely on fossil fuels for their economic stability. I think 90% of their economy relies on fossil fuels, and this increasing focus on sustainability requires leaders to balance their national interests with global climate goals. And I feel like this kind of pushes them back in a sense, because I feel like the fact that they actually were chosen to host COP in the first place would have been like a major move forward for Azerbaijan and their climate and everything, and this has been a step back. But
yeah, but then just see how there's literally no benefit of them actually going ahead with any of these pledges or any of the agreements made, just because of how reliant their economy is on fossil fuels, like 90%. It's not like they can phase out 10% every year, because that's a massive chunk of their economy. Like, could you imagine if it was on a similar scale in the UK, and then suddenly every year we'd have to phase out like a part of our economy? It's impossible for them to really stand up and agree to these sort of pledges, especially since they're hosting this. I think it's just a massive smack in the face for those countries that are genuinely affected by the things that they produce and what they do.
to play devil's advocate a bit, do you think potentially that the comment from that video, as well as President Aliyev's statement that fossil fuels are a gift from God, do you think it could be like a national sort of pride in their natural wealth? Sorry.
I understand where it stems from as far as... This is where, sorry to just clarify for our listeners, in the video, they're talking about the oil company SOCAR, which is like the huge oil gas company, which is like in Azerbaijan, which contributes a huge amount to the economy. So to say then on Samuel's statement, I think I see where it's coming from as far as... to be honest with you, I don't know fully the extent of like Azerbaijani nationalism, but I know for a fact that like in Azerbaijan, SOCAR and oil companies make up a huge amount of their economy, and lots of like Azerbaijani lives depend on them. So it is understandable completely, like Matthew says, why they like would want to defend it or why they would want to not do it. But I think, oh, go on.
Yeah, let me quickly just jump in a little bit about SOCAR. They're not just like a private company; it's a nationalized company, so it's owned by the state and by the government. So it's not like the leaders of Azerbaijan aren't experiencing the profits. They are experiencing directly the profits that go into their pockets or into the pockets of the government. So it's not just like one person at the actual event trying to like praise a specific company. It benefits the whole country for them to advertise SOCAR and trying to push them out.
And I feel like that's super controversial, considering like as the host country, they placed regional climate issues as like one of the top issues on their agenda, including like other stuff like water management and desertification challenges. But this is controversial, like.
Yeah, and I just want to... I feel like as part of, not to sound really dramatic, but I feel like as part of our responsibility on this podcast is to give a voice to different points of view. Like, I think a point of view that I really want to get across here, and the one that like I probably agree with more, is like the voice of critics of COP, because I think it's very justified for critics of COP to look at this, look at what's happened, and to say that like it's a huge step backwards in climate change. I think it can be very emotive, and I'm just gonna like try to, in my best way, kind of emulate what I would expect a critic of COP to say. But like, could you imagine being someone in Barbados where like you're a farmer or you're like a fisherman and you suffer because of climate change, because like fish are dying or like sea level rise and your home's been swept away, and you see like a video at the climate conference where they're trying to agree to how to like help and save your life in that kind
ridiculous.
of way, and then you see someone like trying to basically agree oil deals. I think it's very justified for critics of COP to look at it and kind of, I saw this online actually, calling it the kind of, it's gone from the conference of parties and the kind of COP agreement to the kind of, let's see who could agree the most oil deals, right? I think genuinely my view of COP as being negative doesn't just stem from like my view on climate change generally, but it stems more from the fact that I think it is very hard to justify. I feel like for people who do support COP, and I do understand why the support of COP stems from, because we do need action on climate change. I think that's something we can all like agree on its fundamental role. But I think that it's hard to say that COP has really had that much change in the last few years, or that COP's really successful. I think that every single time there's a step forward at COP, there's a huge step back or like a slap in the face with things like this, with different people kind of agreeing oil deals at a climate conference is something that you just don't do, right? I think that, you know, there's a history of this and a kind of lineage of failure with COP. I think that even though the Paris Agreement was signed by a lot of countries, the kind of commitment to 1.5 emissions, and that was a huge milestone as far as like climate, you know, climate security and also just kind of climate agreements as a whole, for then that to be like a failure and like destroyed essentially when, you know, Trump left the agreement. I believe that China also left the agreement in response, or like watered down their kind of objectives towards it. It's just, I feel like with COP, it's really justifiable for critics of COP. Not saying that like I don't agree with this 100%. I do think COP does have some value, but I am really negative towards it as a whole. I think it's really justifiable for them to say that COP is like always and has historically been, you know, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, right? Like I think it really, really is negative. And I think, you know, COP is undermined as a whole when the COP head, and no, this is the same guy who years ago, like at the last COP, this guy was standing up and saying, you know, how
we need to act now.
Yeah,
and
he was giving speeches about how everyone and countries really need to, you know, help try to reach, you know, net zero. And then now we see him talking about, you know, deals with oil companies and basically saying that, you know, I'll connect you up with who you need to talk to. Like, it's really ridiculous, and I think it really, like, I really sympathise with not only people who, you know, suffer from climate change and like actively have their lives damaged, but I really sympathise with the kind of environmental groups as well. They've been working years and years to try to get climate change. Like there's been hard-working groups that have, you know, aim to try to really get that climate change, or like try to really get policy. I think there's really a slap in the face for all of their hard work, the years of campaigning, different groups, like different people, Greta Thunberg being one. Like, their campaigning feels like it's worthless. Like they feel like they don't matter when they see someone after all that they've done, after like all the, you know, shouting, screaming, protests, etc., like tying yourself to whatever. We've seen it all. After that, for like the person who literally runs COP, which was set up to deal with climate change, to be agreeing oil deals, it's a huge slap in the face.
Yeah, I just want to kind of run off this point and talk about how not only has this been a slap in the face to those people, it's actually emboldened companies to sort of take a stronger stance on their fossil fuel mining. Like even today, the head of OPEC has echoed the Azerbaijani president's comments in praise for oil and gas, and he said himself that they are indeed a gift from God. So I think it's absolutely disgraceful that someone who is meant to be the head of this committee or this COP this year to just go out there and say these things, and then not only does that make himself look bad, but it actually benefits like companies or groups like OPEC to go out and take a stronger stance on that. It may be even increasing their mining of fossil fuels or increasing the trade and sale of fossil fuels.
Yeah, like honestly, considering as well that climate change, just to like backdrop this for viewers, climate change is an issue that's becoming increasingly like more and more pressing, right? In a year where we've seen like, for example, huge storms and different weather events that have hugely harmed, like last episode we were talking about, you know, Hurricane Helene, Milton as well, and loads of like, you know, like heat wave records broken in multiple countries, like drought and also flooding in different areas. We've really seen the kind of, you know, gunpoint of climate change this year, and I think with all of that to happen, like with people who actively are like increasing amounts of climate refugees, right? People who have lost their homes and now like are trying to find places to live because their homes have been like swept away in a storm or, you know, flooded or etc. or like, you know, different things like that. for all of that to happen this year, and for like this to be a year where, you know, like the climate change objectives that people are aiming for are extremely close. Like 2030 is like, you know, 5-6 years away. You know, 2050 is when a lot of these climate objectives are done. That's, you know, approaching very, very soon. I think to have that kind of attitude going into the conference, and like a lot of the messaging from COP is that we need to really get action, you know, to like this year's the year we're going to all talk, and, you know, we're going to come to an agreement on climate finance, and then, you know, following like COP 30, we're going to be prepared to kind of take climate change and take action going forward. I think it just really undermines everything that COP's about, and I think it's just really damaging to the planet as a whole on climate change.
Yeah, there's this one article that I'm reading currently from The Guardian where, as we know, there's campaigners. However, because it's in Azerbaijan, there's like less and less campaigners, but that's not the point. They say that the talks are reaching a point of real emotion as it happened, and they're saying that like talks aren't just about figures on paper, they're about people's lives. So yeah, that really builds up on what you were saying.
Yeah, I'll just add as well, because I want to try to make this podcast a like impartial type of space. I mean, as far as it's worth for the viewers understanding that even though you have a podcast of like, you know, a bunch of Trinity students who like really kind of are negative about COP, I think it's important to say that like there are lots of people who do view COP as positive. I think that like it's justified that there are people who, you know, believe that COP is the like best and only way forward for countries to really agree. And like in some ways I kind of agree with them too. Like I do think the COP is necessary. Or if not COP, I think that like countries working together is the only way you can really get climate change. This is to say that countries themselves don't really want to take action because they lose out with their competitors, right? Like, for example, note if China, for example, committed to like, you know, less coal or like using less, you know, using less fossil fuels to try to get lower greenhouse gas emissions, they would suffer like exponentially, because if other countries are still using it, like Australia, like the US, their economy is now like double hurt because they actually can't compete with these different sources, right? But we say that if we do this action together, it likely means that these economies are kind of equal in that way, and it means that like no one economy is hugely hurt. So I do think that like, I do think despite everything that's said, I do think cooperation is the way forward, but I really think that like despite that, the reasons that we've said still stand. I think that, you know, while cooperation is important, COP has really been undermined by the things we've seen, the different like oil deals, and the fact that it's hosted in Azerbaijan. I think it really calls into question whether COP and whether these type of climate conferences are the way forward. I understand and agree with the underlying principle, but I genuinely don't know if there's like a justification in continuing COP at this point, considering the lack of progress that's been made, considering the fact that we're still like on this, I believe this year we're still on track to like go over the 1.5 limit in like degrees as stated in the Paris Agreement. I think that while like agreements between countries are necessary and like organizations like this are like a good idea, I think genuinely we should be questioning now whether COP and, you know, things like it are the way forward.
So then what do you think would the solution be? What do you think that we can do to create more change or better change?
This is where I actually do want to like go deep into this, because I think it is really interesting, and like a bit of analysis that I just really want to get out is that, well, two things. I think the first is that there are different like models or mechanisms of change that I think that people and like climate scientists agree to. And I think like I'll outline them here and like say which one I agree with, and then probably ask you which one you agree with. I think the second thing is saying that like there are 3 different spheres in which like, you know, climate action occurs. Okay, so on the first thing then, to say that I think there are different ways that like, you know, people perceive climate change or climate action as happening. So like I believe there is like a spectrum of like optimism almost. So imagine on one end there are people who like think that, you know, climate change, we really can, if we work together, get things done now, and they are really optimistic on it. And on the other end there are people who are like, you know, the climate's screwed, right? There's nothing that we can do, and it's kind of over. I've heard lots of different theories. There are probably other ones that like I won't address here, but I think that like going from the end which is optimism to the end where there's less optimism, I think that you have people who are mega optimistic who say that we can get change now, we all just need to work together. I think you have people who are like more moderate who say that okay, like climate change and our action on it has been flawed, but they believe there is still hope, like there is still potential to get things going forward. We do need to work together, get some change. You know, some change is better than none, and then just saying like the small steps kind of approach. The second one, which I think this is one that I agree with and I think is more like pessimistic, is one of generational change. To say what this looks like then is that currently the people in power, so like those who are like presidents, different roles, for example, governments, heads of companies, CEOs, they tend to be older, right? So like no like people who are in power now, like the older generation usually, like when they were growing up, climate change wasn't an issue, right?
Yeah.
Like they generally don't care about these issues. But now currently we have a younger generation that's a lot more infused and a lot more involved in climate change. So the kind of fear around this then and saying that like how you get climate change sorted, this kind of generational fear that I described to you is the idea that over years or like the coming years, next 40 years for example, the next generation that comes into power, like the next generation of CEOs, leaders in government, like us essentially, are going to be actually being able to get climate change done more because we subscribe more to the kind of ideas of climate change, or like we subscribe more and it was more a thing that climate change like happened during our time. So do you have anything you want to say on this?
I kind of get your point, the idea of creating generational change, but I just don't see how that is genuinely feasible with how desperate the situation is now. Like we've got storms like Milton, like today the Philippines, or the first time in the world a country has experienced 4 different cyclones or monsoons, whatever you like to call them, in 4 days in a row. I think the situation is too extreme for us to sort of wait generations and generations, or wait 1 generation and wait 20 years for the first generation of CEOs to sort of shift off and then the new ones to come in and make that change. I think that it's very important that we should start talking about acting now. Maybe even if we don't act directly today, that as long as there's conversation going on, people are going to have to listen. They will have to listen to the voices of the younger generation, like you said, that are more infused and are much more interested. So I'm not really sure how like actionable that idea is. I think it's a good idea, and I think it's something that's like quite a positive idea, but I just don't see it being actionable.
Yeah, I really understand this criticism, and I understand that, lots of people definitely will say that the generational approach, like the main criticism of it is the fact that like climate change is a really pressing issue
It
that
takes
like
too long.
and it just won't work. I think that like obviously my response would be to like people who are probably more optimistic, and I'd probably count you among them, Matthew, is they're like, I think while people like, for example, Trump, while these older leaders are in power, or like while people who are in the spaces of like where these decisions are made, like for example, the people who are on these boards, who are the CEOs, like really don't care about the climate as much. I think it's just really hard to get any change at all. So I think while it's pessimistic, I think that's probably the view I agree with. More on the pessimistic side, I think, just to like finish this up, what I was saying is that I think other than the people who are like on the most pessimistic and saying like the climate is screwed, we should just like not care at all, or like that it's over, and I think that's quite an extreme end. I think before that I have heard a theory from some people where essentially what they say is that it's a kind of that climate change will occur as a result of tipping points. So this is to say that long term what will happen is that in climate we will reach certain tipping points where thing happens, for example like acid rain, melting of glaciers, and then when those tipping points happen, that's how climate change will happen, because people in response to those will like then suddenly, once we reach a point of no return, people will then suddenly like really latch on to climate change and say, okay, we really need to act on this now, and then change will happen in that way. So the question I just wanted to ask you then is that out of those different approaches or different theories, the kind of small steps approach, the kind of optimistic approach that you can get change now, and the kind of more negative ones like what I said, generational theory, and also just including, I hope you don't agree with the like climate is screwed theory, but the one of like tipping points, which one would you say that you subscribe to or agree with most?
I think, in my opinion, that the strongest sort of position to take would be the small steps one, just because I think the tipping points idea is just it's way too late. It's pretty much impossible. Like if let's say we were to get to that tipping point, like we learned quite a lot about in geography about positive feedback loops, where you get to literally, like you said, a point of no return. Like it's practically impossible to sort of stand back the second before and be like, okay, let's suddenly change everything now, because things don't happen overnight. Change doesn't happen. Like it's not like we're gonna expect a COP to come out with every single solution for climate change within a week or two. It's better to have these conversations and take these small steps rather than wait till the last minute and try and solve something. And I think that's also better than the idea of taking a generational approach. While I think in the long term it's quite a good idea to sort of gradually change out those CEOs and those world leaders, I think that it's just an unfeasible problem with how big the issue of climate change actually is at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. It's a reasonable approach. I don't think there's any like wrong approach apart from the kind of climate screwed one that like I think I disagree with. But I definitely think it's one thing to take. I just talk about the second thing quickly then, which I want to talk about, and this is maybe justifies the reason why I think the generational change is the kind of way you get climate change or like climate action, is that I think that like this is relates more to the way organizations, for example, like climate groups, name here like Greenpeace, Extinction Rebellion, other more extreme groups you may know, like Just Stop Oil, for example, try to get climate change. I think they do it in like there's 3 different groups that they target. So this is like broadly. Where I think there's like one which is companies, the second which is like government, so they try to lobby like this is COP, for example. And I think the third is like individuals, so it's like trying to encourage individuals to actually take action themselves. So for example, like encouraging more people to recycle, encouraging people to like eat less meat, for example, things like this. I think on like all 3, it's just really hard to like get any action anyway. And this is part of the reason why like I'm generally just so negative about climate change, because I think that like I'll go through the 3, but before that, go on.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to jump in a little bit. I completely agree with you because I feel like in countries that are not like considered the West, there's not really much of a recycling like culture where people will actively go out of their way to try and recycle, which then obviously landfills, methane waste, which is something that we're going to talk about later on in the podcast. But yeah.
Yeah, like, so I'll go through, like, I just want to really, because I want to get Matthew, like, I've been waiting to pick your brains on this and, you know, get what you think.
Before that, can I quickly just jump in what Samuel had to say about like landfills and stuff? Just see how this doesn't work in reality, because big countries like the UK, United States, even places in Europe and China, they export a lot of their waste that is to be recycled to these countries like Indonesia, for example, places
Vietnam's
like Malaysia,
one.
yeah, Vietnam as well.
It makes them suffer more.
No, but not even that. They export their recycling to be recycled there, and then the recycling is just left in landfills.
Or, like,
I've seen,
incinerators.
yeah,
or...
plenty of documentaries by like places like the BBC, who go to these landfills where they're supposedly recycling a lot of this material, and in reality they're burning it, or it's literally just left in a massive, huge field full of like things like cardboard, plastics that can be recycled, but they're just sort of abandoned by the company or by whatever government has made that agreement to actually do anything.
Yeah, and a big part of this as well is e-waste, which I remember particularly as one of the, because e-waste, no, like this, we're talking about e-waste, we're talking about phones, things like this.
Electronic waste,
phone
exactly.
They have like some precious minerals inside of them, right? So when we throw away a phone, like it has like gold and like different valuable materials in the chips. So what will actually happen is a lot of our e-waste is like transported to countries where they try to actually extract this, and like they will end up using lots of different techniques which are like not environmentally friendly at all to try to basically extract these kind of minerals and resources.
Yeah, and see how this is also inhumane, because a lot of these things like telephones, even batteries like car batteries, get sent to poor workers in extremely poor countries, places like Sierra Leone or even places in Asia, where they literally have to cut open the batteries and pour out the lithium from the batteries, which is extremely toxic for their bodies. Yeah, I think that's like an extremely bad thing to.
With like an economic point of view, I feel like it would be more. It's a higher cost in order to manage and maintain these landfills. Whereas if people actually went out of their way and were encouraged to actually recycle, then this wouldn't be such an issue. There's like loads of missed opportunities with landfill waste, like representing like sort of lost economic potential to in a sense. As many of these materials, like you said, Kalel, could be recovered and reused in industries, creating jobs and reducing the demand for virgin resources.
But then just see, even if people are to recycle more, it doesn't necessarily mean that stuff is recycled. Note that many of these companies that say that they are going to recycle, they just end up getting shipped off anyway, and they just get ended up left in landfill. So it's not, even if everybody in the world were to recycle tomorrow, it doesn't actually solve the issue.
Doesn't affect anything. Yeah. There's also I don't know if you guys know what this is, but there's a toxic liquid that forms in landfills called leachate, and if it's not properly managed, there's a lot of like social issues and like to an extent human rights issues, because as you said, they're sent to like countries such as Indonesia and everything where they're not properly these landfills are not properly managed. What do you guys think would be like the health issues and human rights issues and views on this?
Yeah, to make clear to our listeners, what Samuel's referring to there, leachate, is essentially when we throw away different parts of like waste. This includes like electronic waste and also different parts of waste. Basically, like different. It's hard to explain, but different like waste particles, or like for example,
like bin juice, basically.
Like stuff from our like phone, for example, like I think the batteries they'll kind of leak and like parts will leach out, which essentially like they get kind of stored in the soil and stored in the ground.
Yeah, it's a mix of different metals. Like you said in the batteries, there's like lithium particles and stuff that leak out when they get.
What essentially happens is that this kind of soaks into the ground where the landfill is, and it has like huge environmental impacts. So like, the worst of like I was gonna say the worst of which, best of which, like none of them are good, but the worst of which is definitely like there's lots of cases where this kind of it destroys not only the natural environment around it, so like different like there's been examples of like trees dying nearby landfills, things like this. But the worst specifically as well is the way it usually affects humans is that this kind of leachate will like leach through the soil and actually end up in like water supplies like rivers. The reason why this is hugely bad is because you essentially have people, if you have people drinking like leachate, it's hugely negative. I believe there was like, I want to say there's been different scandals around this, about like having landfills too close to water sources. It's something that just is really bad and really damaging for people's health.
Yeah, I've never really heard about leachate, but I could kind of see that happening anyway in practically any landfill, especially with things like e-waste where there's so many toxic metals or things that are found within the technology, the electronic waste in itself. Yeah, I think that's absolutely awful, and it's so sad to think that people that live in high-income countries are able to sort of think that they're doing the right thing by recycling their products or dropping off their products into places where they're claimed to be specifically for electronic waste, places like landfills that say they are specifically recycling that sort of that electronic waste, and in reality it's damaging people's lives.
Yeah, I just really wanted, I think this leads me on nicely to the analysis I want to go into about like the three kind of groups. I think that the thing to really state is that like for individuals then, and the kind of individual change that environmental groups try to get, like while, and to play devil's advocate to what we have just been saying, I think to what some extent, like, and not even devil's advocate, I probably kind of agree with this, that like, I think the recycling movement, things like this have actually been successful. Like you have seen an increase in lots of people in like, particularly UK, different Western countries, recycling, being more climate aware. You maybe have an increase in some people, like, for example, watching what they eat, ethical consumption, that kind of thing. I think that it is really relevant and important to say that like while these are successful though, the reason why I think that like the climate movement still isn't really successful as far as doing this is because that's like the smallest emitter, right? We say like individuals and like their contributions to the climate change, even if we were to really become like very green, friendly, we were to all recycle, we were to all like change our practices and do this, I think still like it wouldn't really help. Main reason being is because I think the main emitters are like companies and governments. So like, to move on, and then I really want to ask Matthew questions on this, is like, I'll start with governments, because I think we both do probably something we can talk about, is I think it's really hard to get governmental change at all concerning the environment, for like the main reason that governments have a huge like incentive to really not want to like, to prioritise the economy and not want to like prioritise the environment. I have kind of two things here, and I'll probably ask Matthew, is like, the first is that I think that different like governments and different, people who want to get elected, for example, president, whatever, they will run their campaigns on kind of economics or run it on kind of, the main example that comes to mind is Trump, like Make America Great Again. They'll run it essentially on like, bringing back kind of old economics and like old economies of like, production, manufacturing, and like the message that they literally put out is the opposite of like, climate change and becoming more environmentally friendly. And I think the second thing is saying that like the same governments that we really talk about and that these like groups do lobby, focusing specifically here on environmental groups, like when Greenpeace, for example, lobbies the UK government and says, okay, we really want climate policy, and they'll give them like money, lobbyists, they'll invest in this. The thing that we don't take into account is a like massive counter lobby of like these oil companies and like gas companies that will lobby the government using like billions of pounds compared to millions, and like it really just pushes out the kind of green like views. So the very governments and the very like parties that were asking for change are the same ones that are like hugely funded their election campaigns and different things by like oil companies. I think we can see an example here of like, Trump's election campaign funded like by oil companies, billions and billions of dollars. Even in the UK, lots of like for example, the Conservative Party and lots of different political parties funded hugely by kind of a counter lobby to environmentalists, which includes like oil companies. I think it's really hard to expect any change from governments for this reason. That's kind of why I subscribe to the generational view, because I just don't think there's really a way they can be successful in this route as well. What do you think?
Well, just before I give my take, I just want to jump in on that idea of these governments. I'd say a great example is Azerbaijan itself, who has literally had the same leader since 2003 for over 20 years, and they have been known for like crushing any sort of local opposition to their power.
Yeah, it's an
So
autocratic
yes,
democracy,
exactly.
yeah.
So it's quite hard to think that why are we hosting a COP that is meant to be about discussing climate change in literally an autocratic regime? Like that completely doesn't make sense to me. And just before I go into my opinion, would you mind clarifying what you mean? Or like your question?
Like, do you think that climate, like basically, do you think that environmental organizations can achieve change through governments? Like, do you think it's worth them doing lobbying? Because to some extent, while I understand and see why, like, because I think this is like, it reaches the very like root question of like, why do we have COP and like why, like, can it be successful? Do you think it's even worth in the first instance like these climate groups really focusing on that? Like, do you think there's any potential, or like not even any potential, but how much do you think these climate groups can really achieve change as far as in the governmental direction?
I think they can achieve some change, but obviously with the big hand of corporations and companies kind of standing above governments in a sense, it's quite difficult. Like we've seen, I know we kind of all sit a little bit negative against COP. We have seen something that Samuel was mentioning about countries choosing to cut methane recently, I think.
Yeah, there was 30 countries, it was yesterday actually, 30 countries at COP collectively responsible for nearly 50% of global methane from organic waste emissions. They endorsed a COP29 declaration on reducing methane from organic waste. They range actually, quite shockingly. There's big countries and small countries, including Russia, the US, the UK, but also countries such as Eritrea, Serbia, and Malta. One that really confuses me though is Brazil, because Brazil, this is sort of going back to talk about the landfills and everything. Brazil don't, like, they're known for having a lot of space to like leave their land, leave their waste, but it corresponds to about 1.01 kilograms of waste per person per day. And as you can imagine, Brazil's got a very large population, which obviously would release a lot of methane gas. But yeah, you can continue your point.
Yeah, big issue, especially with Brazil, I find, is the fact that they've got so much farming going on. Things like cows that release a lot of methane throughout just like breathing and pooing, for example. That in itself is practically impossible to cut through these kind of agreements. And if anything, they're going to increase even more as people's quality of life improves and their diet starts to diversify and they start to eat more meat or introduce more meat into their diets. But going back to Kalel's idea of like whether environmental things can actually create change, I think they can, but I can kind of see why you subscribe to the generational idea in that sense, because it obviously will take time and you have to wait for these companies to sort of have a change of mind. But I just think that it's impossibly slow to realistically see any results out of it if you wait like 20, 30 years for all the CEOs to kind of like die off and then like younger people getting more involved in these higher positions in companies. So I can kind of see what you mean by that, but I can see these sort of organizations having some successes. Take, for example, these sort of agreements that countries are making, even countries like Russia and the United States, even though we might see some change in the United States opinions. And also take note that this COP has been described as like the finance COP. It's not exactly about these sort of environmental changes. It's very heavily focused on the finances and how big countries like the UK, China and the United States can provide money for poorer countries. Take like sub-Saharan region countries, for example, or Southeast Asian countries, which may be lower income or newly industrialized, that can't exactly afford to defend themselves or diversify their economies. Take also like Azerbaijan, 90% of their stuff relies on fossil fuels. So I think it's very important to really hone in and focus on like the finances of this COP. I think today we've seen small countries like Barbados call it a joke that the European Union has the idea of promising $300 billion by 2030 to these countries to help mitigate the issues or to help try and defend themselves against the issues created by climate change, where they want $1.2 trillion from these rich countries. So I just want to get your thoughts on whether these sort of plans or these ideas are achievable.
As already said, I think I'm very negative on this. Maybe I should have led with the kind of reasons why I think that like climate change isn't really going to be that successful as far as the different ways to, like the different routes I had explained before. I said that I think generational change is the only way forward, but like not to be too pessimistic. Like I definitely would say that Matthew, ever the optimist here. Like I would definitely say that I just think that it's really difficult to foresee how like, because I agree to some extent, and I actually not even to some extent, I agree to a large extent that climate financing is important, and it is like right to have this as a focus at COP, just because purely the fact that like smaller countries both like a lot of the times aren't really willing, and in the other times like just can't afford to really like invest in, for example, climate technology, or to like try to diversify away from like, you know,
fossil fuels and
things like this. Like, I think it is important to do that, but I just think that ultimately, like, this is where I think I'm somewhat sympathetic with the small steps approach, because I do think that there is an ability to get like some change from countries, but I just do think as well that like Barbados was never going to get the kind of trillions that it wanted for like climate change, right? This is just to say that like I think it's really difficult to be optimistic about the climate when you see like, you know, COP being undermined, when you see like agreements that do happen but like are withdrew from, for example, by the US, and when you do see these kind of like money being promised but just not in the amounts that like is anywhere near what's even like necessary or needed for countries to really cope with climate change. I just wanted to talk about this last thing, and this probably finishes up my like, you know, whole kind of spiel and analysis on like the ways that climate change happens. I think something's worth talking about as well, and the last thing is kind of the way companies, right, are like involved in this, because I think that, you know, the company in Azerbaijan, the like state-owned company, is a huge part of this. Yeah, SOCAR is like a huge part of this kind of conference and a huge way we view COP. And I think that like COP is important as well to try to set legislation on companies. But I just wanted to like outline kind of two reasons why I also think, not to be like too negative again, but why I also think that like companies just aren't the way forward and you can't get any change from them also. I think the first is just saying, it's kind of clearer with companies, is that they have a motivation for profit more so than they do the environment, right? So this is to say that like companies obviously like are motivated by wanting to get profit for their shareholders. I think this just means that they like don't care about the environment near as much as like environmental groups, or like nearly enough as like they should. This is just say like different companies really don't like want to actively change their practice unless they're pushed by like government legislation or other things like this, because they fundamentally make more profit by like using fossil fuels than they do like not using it, right? They make more profit by like, you know, using like really long shipping routes if it's cheaper, rather than like growing things at home, or like using, you know, this is talking about like food miles, right? I think the second thing is to say that like, I think this is something that I really wanted to talk to Matthew specifically about, is about like boycotting and like the actions that like these environmental groups do actually take. This is to say that like, I actually think that boycotting has been influential and has actually been like useful in getting companies to accept environmental change. So this is to say that like, I think companies definitely care when they are boycotted and like people don't buy goods from them, because it directly impacts the amount of profit they make.
Yeah, they lose money.
I think it's definitely very effective, and we've seen like change. The reason why I think though that like despite this and despite companies caring about it, it hasn't been effective is, and it's just one thing that I really want to say here, is that not only will like they not last for long, right? So like they will often like be lifted because you can't get enough people to like boycott. And like some of these goods are things that we literally can't like cut out of our, like if I own a car and I want to drive it, I can't cut out using like BP or like oil and gas like from my, you know, from my regular life, from my day. Like it's just something that I can't physically do, which is one. But the second I think is that like we've seen lots of examples of like companies giving small kind of climate, like giving small kind of contributions, and then like, you know, environmental groups then deciding to lift the kind of restrictions. One example I have here is kind of like the Starbucks, like, you know, agreeing to like not use plastic straws and to make their cups recyclable, or like they, you know, straws recyclable. I don't know much about Starbucks specifically, but I just want to like posit to you the example here, right? Where for different like coffee companies, for example, they, to like make their coffee, they will have ships that they use which like emit thousands and thousands, or like, you know, lots of like greenhouse gas emissions. They will have them travel like to Brazil, like collect cocoa beans, and then come back, or like the beans used for coffee, and they'll come all the way back, generate all those emissions, and like that hugely hurts like the climate. But then when they have like a boycott, the change they'll make is to say, oh, okay, guys, rather than change like our working practices that emit like loads of, you know, emissions, and rather than change the fact that we ship like beans from, you know, Brazil, wherever, instead, oh, guys, look, we've got like plastic, we've got, you know, recyclable cups now and recyclable straws, and like climate, and
kind
you know,
of like a scapegoat.
yeah, and environmental movements will go, oh yeah, that's fine. And then in my mind, I'm just like, you know, I kind of shudder, and I'm like, what? They literally still have like the same practices that they were using before. They still generate like thousands of emissions through just, you know, food miles and like transport. But like you're fine with them saying, oh look guys, you know, our cups are now recyclable now. Oh look, our like lids, you know, are able to be recycled if you like separate them from the cup. I think like even though the basis of boycotts have been like is is a good aim, and I think that they are effective as far as companies care about their profits. So when you actually do hurt their sales, they listen to you more likely than if you just say that they're bad. I think that just because of this, it's really been unsuccessful. I wanted to ask Matthew, what do you think about the effectiveness of boycotts? And do you think as well that in this kind of last approach that companies are an effective route to try to essentially enact climate change or reduce their emissions?
I have a strangely negative opinion on boycotts. I just think they're absolutely useless, particularly first because they're pretty much impossible to actually make a major dent in the company's profits. So let's say 1 million people were to boycott Apple. I mean, let's say Apple, for example, there would be so many other people that are buying constantly. For example, Samuel, who's, I would say, the number one fan of Apple.
Hearing you say boycott Apple just hurts my soul.
Yeah, I just think it's pretty much impossible to organise an effective boycott that is genuinely going to impact the company. But kind of talking about the second thing that you were saying about whether it's possible to get change in these companies, I think there are a few sort of ways you can sort of stream in. Think about young investors or people that are starting to earn money, much more money from a younger age. Say take India, a place like India for example, where the most young billionaires are coming from now, that are investing in these massive companies. They are able to sort of put a bit of pressure. Obviously, it won't be a massive amount, but a bit of pressure on these leaders within companies like Apple or Starbucks, for example. I know it's a bit of a far-fetched idea in your eyes. But
Okay, I definitely disagree. I think you're on the right track, but I definitely disagree with this part about young investors kind of being a part of it. I think the way this probably the way I would agree with you and say this, I think this probably more looks like you do see a lot of startups which are actually trying to be actively environmentally friendly. Not to kind of stereotype, but the example that you do kind of see is, for example, in London, different types of hipster groups, for example, ensuring that they're actively very eco-friendly, that they everything is recyclable, that their food might be locally grown, plant-based, etc. This is to say that I think that's more what it looks like, having smaller startups do this, but go on.
I feel like let's go back to the topic of coffee beans, for example. I feel like one very quite relatively new coffee shop, Blank Street. I feel like their use of technology and their use of climate action has really put their sales much higher than and taken customers away from Starbucks and Costa that still kind of use non-recyclable things. But I think Matthew, you wanted to say something.
I've just completely forgot how I was going to touch on.
But, okay, to finish up this conversation, I'm sorry I've gone on about this for so long, and I probably hand the floor back to Samuel. I want to ask then, but Matthew, how do you think then? Because you said that companies, you don't think it will work. You said that individuals don't think it will work, and you said that governments, I think it'll work to some extent, despite the huge the counter lobby from these groups. I just want to ask then, so how do you think this how do you think this small steps approach will actually work? Because while I agree that I am definitely hugely negative, if you want something positive about climate action, I'm definitely not the person to ask, right? I do think that I accept that I am quite pessimistic about the way I think climate change is going to happen and the way I think this kind of generational long-term change is going to come about. But with saying what you said about the fact that you think that these different methods of change aren't really going to be that successful, how can you possibly agree then, or why is it then do you think that why do you subscribe to the small steps approach if you believe on one hand that is the approach to take, but then on the other hand these approaches won't work? Is it just from an outside perspective, is it just the kind of optimism that something has to happen, so we therefore just have to agree with this on hope, or is it more of you actually do think that it's possible as far as in our lifetimes or something like that?
I agree with the small steps approach because I think we are seeing the small steps approach happen right now.
Mm-hmm.
Take somewhere like China, one of the world's largest emitters, tripling the amount of solar panels and sort of renewable energies that they're constructing. That's a big, quite a solid step in the right direction. Take somewhere like the UK where GB Energy, with the government investing £8 billion of money into focusing mainly on renewables, hydroelectric power and wind energy. Also, things like you said with startups, take something like the Earthshot Prize, which provides £1 million to 5 different startup companies, which gives them a massive platform for many different, wide amount of investors who want to look into sort of improving the climate. So it's not about disagreeing with the idea that nothing is going to happen, it's impossible to actually create change. I think, in my opinion, that the change is happening now and that we need to push it on to actually make a difference by, like, take all of the tipping point dates of 2030, 40, 50, 2100 we've even seen. So that's my take.
Yeah, I definitely like to give that to listeners. I think it's important that like I definitely do agree with a lot of that. Like I can see why someone would be like optimistic about the environment. I think that there's definitely been huge steps forward in as far as like green energy has been a specific place that Chinese companies investing into this, companies around the world investing into this, governments really taking part in like wanting to have more wind farms, for example, in the UK, things like this. I definitely agree. I know I may sound like kind of grumpy old man, like the climate, no chance. But yeah, I'm happy our viewers get to hear that, and yeah, I'm happy with that.
Okay, heading slightly back towards COP. I wanted to go back to this list of the 30 countries that agreed to slash their methane waste. One that I didn't see, and I wanted to ask you this, Kalel, because I know you got quite a strong opinion on this. Saudi Arabia was not on that list. Saudi Arabia, as for viewers, they're a very oil-rich country, and their economy is kind of reliant on it. How do you think? What do you think on the fact that Saudi Arabia have like disagreed with this? Considering if they slash their methane waste, then they'd essentially kind of be slashing their economy.
Do you want to answer this one?
Say something first, and I'll come to it.
Okay, for sure. Yeah, I think again it just links to everything that we said. I think countries that like this is a fundamental problem with like climate change as an issue, and like this is part of the reason why I'm so pessimistic about it. It's just I think that fundamentally, right, like climate change is one of those issues where the countries that emit the most emissions, so we're talking like China, Russia, USA, and like other countries, I'm not going to include Azerbaijan there, but like countries that like do emit loads are the same countries that like are the most negatively impacted if they agree to this climate legislation, or if they like try to reduce their emissions. So like the same people that we're asking to reduce their climate emissions are the same ones who like would be hurt the most and like actually don't want to the most, which is why it's so like difficult to get change at all. And in my view, I really like that's why I'm so negative about it. I think like an equivalent example is like I don't even know how I'd illustrate this, but it's really counterintuitive to like ask the person like that benefits from it the most, like the people who benefit from fossil fuels the most, the countries that use them, like to then ask them not to use it. I think it's really like counterintuitive. This is why as well I think in the case of China, and this is something that we could possibly talk about, is that with them I think that the tipping point for them as far as like being more active on climate change will occur when the kind of damages that climate change does to their economy becomes like higher than the benefits that their economy has from like coal and like fossil fuels. This is say that Chinese fishing, for example, is like one specific example, loses like millions, 2 billions a year based on like fish dying essentially and like different climate change impacts like flooding as well. I think the point at which that like economic impact of climate change outweighs the economic benefit of like using fossil fuels and having more energy and things like this, I think that's when maybe we'll see change. But I think the economy's been an issue to do with climate change like so much ever since like climate change became a thing that we were talking about. I think that the issue of climate finance in COP has been one that we've been talking about for years, like even since like COP was an idea.
Yeah, for me it's the biggest issue. It's really comes down to when you really want to make something to change, it ultimately comes down to the economy and whether people can afford to or want to pay for it.
Yeah, and I just think that's really what it comes down to, and I think that's fundamentally like on my side I think that's why we won't get much climate change or like much action on climate change going forward, because thinking about it, the countries that emit the most, the countries that really we do need to change. Like we're not talking about smaller countries like for example smaller countries in Africa. We're not talking about like Barbados. They don't contribute like nowhere near as much, right, to like I believe it's over like 25% of like 25% of emissions are like US. I think like there's up like around 25% is like China, Russia, etc. Those are the countries that you need to change. The countries that you want to like pay are like the developed countries. So that's like we're talking about US, China as well, who like they want them to pay for like climate reparations, climate action, things like this. But then also they're also the ones who are like most harmed when they actually pursue this. So like you can understand why for a country like China they really just wouldn't want to get involved or like, you know, make really steps on their climate, because it's just, they're not only being asked to like reduce their climate emissions because they're the ones who they need to, they're being asked to also like pay for it because like other countries can't afford it, and China's like a bigger country, or like America included as well, want to pay for it. And they're also the ones whose like economies suffer from it the most by actually like reducing their carbon emissions. It's really like, it's really understandable from my point of view why like we're just really not going to get that much change, and why these countries like wouldn't agree, for example.
Then can I counter that? Can I counter that by asking what you think about the United Arab Emirates, who are also quite dependent on fossil fuels?
Like I really think again like,
because they've actually agreed to reducing their methane waste. So.
yeah, and I understand, but I really think that even despite this, I just don't think we're going to see countries, for example, like UAE, other countries that are like, you know, emitters of carbon. I don't think we'll really see huge strides in change like this, right? Like I say again that, you know, even though the UAE has agreed to this, right, they've agreed to like reducing methane emissions. What is like the main emissions that come out of the UAE? It comes from like oil and gas and like fossil fuels, right? But they haven't made an agreement on this. Surprise, surprise. This is just to say like, I really don't think that, like, I understand the small steps approach that Matthew subscribes to, but I just really don't think that we're going to see much like huge strides in climate change in the coming like, you know, decade, years coming forward. I'm really pessimistic on this. I just want to make clear, like, I just don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly follow on from Kalel's point about especially methane waste. Like we see countries like Saudi Arabia that is pretty much impossible for them to really emit much methane because they don't have the land for things like farms because it's so hot there. Whereas you've got countries like Brazil, who is one of the largest methane emitters in the world, not subscribing to these sort of agreements. So it's kind of like it's like a small country subscribing to donating to itself. Like it just doesn't make sense to make any sort of genuine or realistic change objectively. But I'd like to quickly turn back to the Saudi Arabia, especially this year in COP29, where we've seen Saudi Arabia blocking negotiations to prevent a repeat on its pledge to transition away from fossil fuels, which they made at COP28. So they've been accused of being a, quote, wrecking ball because of its obstructionist tactics and trying to extend like debates and communication, or trying to make it quite difficult to communicate with them on these kind of issues. So I just want to ask Kalel, since like I know how sort of against this whole idea of discussion is and how much this backs your like your kind of view, but don't you think it's better to take these smaller steps rather than kind of waste time with these huge events that end up kind of producing nothing like we see with Saudi Arabia?
I understand the small steps approach. It's just, I think that this is where like, I feel like the small steps approach, like this is where you're hurt by your own like kind of analysis or definition of how, because like we all agree, right, that climate change is a pressing issue, that like we need action now, right? And like on my side it's like, okay, we'll get big action but we'll get it like long term. But then also on your side you're like, we'll get really small action but like we'll get it like now. This is to say, like, I think on both sides, like, no matter what you subscribe to, you essentially kind of agree that, like, no, I don't think that the small steps approach is really going to be able to, like, help or, you know, create enough change in the time that we need it to, right? Like, when we decide these dates for when, so for example, when, like, COP decides, you know, 2030 we're going to have this, 2050 we're going to have this, these aren't just arbitrary dates that, like, people just pick out of a book and say, okay, this day.
Yes.
Like, these are actual realistic climate tipping points. Like, by 2030, it's like we see, like, I want to say it's the Iceland glacier is going to be like completely melted. By 2050, we'd like to see like impacts like acid rain, for example, become hugely worse. Sea level rise get even worse. This is to say that I think, like, this is a kind of message I also just really want to get out to listeners, like who's listening to the podcast. Climate change is something that we really need action on now. Like, I think that's something we can all agree on, and I think if that's the message you want to take away from this podcast, like maybe don't listen to, you know, grumpy old me being like, you know, climate change, there's no hope, but like, I think even if you subscribe to the approach that Matthew takes or the approach that like we take, I think we can all agree that like neither of them is really that successful, really going to be able to like get the change that we need now. So I think like maybe something that's good to end off on is the like things like COP and like you know the different climate change and the steps we've taken like are good, right? We all agree that like things like this are beneficial, but they're just really not enough to deal with the issue of climate change like going forward. They're like, we really need more action, and like no matter what you believe is going to happen, no matter what kind of theory you subscribe to on how climate change will occur, and like no matter what you believe, I think that ultimately we're in like a very dark place as like a planet, and I don't think it's really going to get that much better going forward. But I also think that, you know, like I don't, like, part of the reason I'm pessimistic on it is not just because, like, I obviously don't want the environment to, like, you know, not, like, I don't want the planet to, like, burn, but it's just saying, like, I think that we're in a really bad place as far as climate change.
Yeah, I just want to send kind of like my last message to viewers or listeners even, that it's kind of hard for us in the position that we live in, like somewhere like the UK, even somewhere like London in itself, to really experience like the true nature of what climate change means for people. Mm-hmm. So I think if we were to sort of live one day in a place like Mozambique or like Namibia, for example, where they genuinely see like the effects of climate change when their crops fail, or when they can't feed their families for a week, or when they can't afford to sell their crops because it's all failed, I think that's genuinely where we will start to see change, where people actually experience like the sort of problems. Take, for example, something so sad that we've seen recently in such a rich country like Valencia in Spain, where we've seen so many people die from those horrific floods and those periods of drought that they had experienced throughout the summer, with no rain for 4 months. So I think it's until people genuinely start to experience the effects of climate change, I don't think that the action will really happen.
Yeah, like, we're so detached. I just, like, a quote that I just even wanted to say is, someone from Hurricane Milton, this is like someone who had to flee their home and leave, it was Florida, they had to leave like where they lived, and basically like now they're a climate refugee, their home's gone, right? They basically said, and this is like the quote, they said, I guess this is what the world looks like now. And it's kind of like, I think that's really just an important message to kind of say that, like, the world that we're going to grow up in, and like how, you know, children, whatever, will grow up in, is likely going to look far, far different than the one like that we see today. So that's why I think like climate change is so important. And also, I think it's easy for someone in America who's been impacted by Hurricane Milton to say that. I think if you imagine, like, or you think about the people who have been for years and years, since like 2016, 2015, 2018, been impacted in different countries, like in different areas in Africa, you know, in Asia, from like monsoon flooding, from like drought. I think it's really hard to look at the positives of climate change because of what we've seen around the world, because of like we've seen people like dying, losing their homes, losing their livelihoods, you know, families, children, things like this, right? It's something that like definitely we'll see more of going forward, and it's something that like I can't be positive about.
Yeah, I think literally the last thing I want to say is that particularly this is like kind of aimed at those that own these massive companies, these oil and gas companies, that they've kind of been like drunk on oil and gas, and they need to sober up now. Like, they need to sober up and stop drinking all of this oil and gas and selling and buying all of this oil and gas. Like, please, you know,
like this is not the world that we want our like kids to grow up in, guys. Like, someone.
Well, that was a great way to end today's episode, and it was a great conversation today. We had Kalel's very pessimistic, quote-unquote, grumpy old man stance, as well as Matthew and myself's negative/neutralist view. But anyway, COP29 is still an ongoing thing, and will finish quite soon. I think it finishes on Friday. Mm-hmm. If listeners are interested, all three of us, we really recommend for you guys to have a look at the news and also the COP29 website, and we strongly urge you guys to do this. But apart from that, thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed, and another episode will most likely be posted next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Trinity Talks. Today's news, tomorrow's leaders. This is the official podcast of Trinity Academy Brixton. Today's episode was written and recorded by Samuel, Kalel and Matthew. The editing was done by Miss Johnston. Make sure to tune in next week for another episode, and if you would like to get involved, please contact us via our email, socials@trinity.futureacademies.org. You can also follow us on social media at Trinity Brixton on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, or at Trinity Academy Brixton on YouTube.